There is a sound in the Irish twilight that has terrified more generations than any other. It is the sound of a scream that travels on the wind, a lonely, high-pitched wail that does not threaten violence, but promises sorrow. To the modern world, this figure is a Halloween trope, the Banshee, a spooky ghost story told to frighten children. But the folklore hides a much deeper and much darker reality. The Banshee is not a ghost. She is the debris of a shattered religion. She is the last surviving memory of the ancient goddesses of sovereignty who once ruled this island, a deity of war and earth who was stripped of her power and forced to haunt the families she once protected. To understand her, we have to ignore the cheap horror movies and dig back through 2,000 years of history. We have to move from the Victorian cottage to the medieval battlefield, and finally, to the ancient burial mounds of the Iron Age. We are going to find out why she screams, who she is screaming for, and why, even after centuries of silence, the memory of the woman of the mound refuses to die. The sound remains the single most consistent element of the encounter. While descriptions of her appearance shift like mist, withered hag, beautiful maiden, or hooded crow, the description of her voice retains a terrifying uniformity across centuries of folklore. It enters the historical record not as a simple human scream, but as a complex auditory phenomenon that mimics the chaotic frequencies of nature itself. Witnesses in the archives of the Irish Folklore Commission frequently struggled to categorize it, often resorting to analogies of the wild environment to capture its quality. They described it as the sound of a heron screeching in flight, the grinding of two stones in a cavern, or the high, thin whistle of wind forcing its way through a cracked window frame. This sonic ambiguity served a specific psychological function. It allowed the entity to camouflage itself within the natural soundscape of the rural night. A sudden gust of wind or the cry of a vixen could be dismissed by the skeptical mind, but for the believer, these sounds carried a second, hidden frequency. The true cry of the Banshee distinguished itself by its duration and its rhythm. It possessed a rising and falling cadence, a melodic structure that separated it from the random noises of the animal kingdom. It was a song composed in a key of absolute despair, designed to be recognized by the human soul rather than the human ear. The physical impact of the sound upon the listener was visceral. Reports from County Clare and Galway often emphasize a physiological reaction that preceded the intellectual realization of what was happening. Those who heard it described a sudden, intense coldness seizing the chest, a sensation of the blood slowing in the veins. The sound carried a physical weight, pressing against the walls of the cottage and vibrating through the timber and thatch. It operated as a sonic assault, stripping away the comfort of the hearth and forcing the inhabitants to acknowledge the proximity of the other world. This mournful cry operated as a formal announcement. In the strict social code of the Irish supernatural, the Banshee functioned as a herald rather than a predator. Her scream announced the transition of a soul from the community of the living to the community of the dead. It was a status symbol, a dark privilege afforded to the high Milesian families, the ancient aristocracy of the island. To hear the scream was to know that one of your blood was marked for departure. The terror lay in the ambiguity of the target. The cry announced a death in the house, but it rarely specified the victim, leaving the family to look at one another in the firelight, wondering which among them was the intended traveler. The volume of the cry often correlated with the social standing of the dying figure. A low, sobbing moan might accompany the passing of a minor branch of the family, while the death of a clan chieftain or a figure of great importance commanded a shriek that could be heard across entire parishes. This acoustic scaling reinforced the entity's role as a guardian of the lineage. She was amplifying the significance of the death, ensuring that the passing of a noble bloodline did not go unnoticed by the land itself. The environment grieved with the family, the supernatural world adding its voice to the human chorus of sorrow. Yet the most chilling aspect of the anatomy of the scream was its directional impossibility. Folklore collections are filled with accounts of men who attempted to locate the source of the wailing. They would hear it clearly in the west, run toward it, and instantly hear it relocate to the east. It possessed a ventriloquistic quality, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. This omnidirectional characteristic suggested that the sound was not traveling through the air, but manifesting within the atmosphere surrounding the house. It was an omnipresent reality, enveloping the home in a sphere of sound that isolated the family from the rest of the world, locking them into a private moment of communion with their ancestral doom. While the cry served as the primary announcement, the folklore archives contain a wealth of visual accounts that transform the entity from a disembodied voice into a physical presence. These manifestations occurred most frequently in the liminal hours, the grey space of twilight or the first light of dawn. Witnesses described a figure standing near the boundaries of the domestic space, at the river ford, by the garden gate, or most chillingly, pressing her face against the glass of the bedroom window. In these visual encounters, the Banshee carried specific accoutrements that identified her trade. The most persistent iconographic detail was the silver comb. She appeared constantly engaged in the act of grooming her long, flowing hair, a ritualistic motion that hypnotized the viewer and connected her to the ancient mermaids and sirens of the coastline. The entity oscillated between two distinct, contradictory physical archetypes. In one tradition, she appeared as the stereotypical Hag of the Mist, a small, withered woman wearing a grey cloak, her eyes red from centuries of weeping. This form embodied the decay of the grave and the ancient weight of the lineage. Yet, a parallel and equally strong tradition depicted her as a young, radiantly beautiful woman, often taller than a mortal, wearing a shroud of white or silver. This duality reflected the two faces of death itself, the terrifying physical reality of the corpse and the romanticized, tragic beauty of the life lost in its prime. Both forms shared the same demeanor of profound, crushing sorrow. Beyond the comb, the Banshee performed a specific somatic ritual known as the clapping of hands. This gesture acted as the visual counterpart to the auditory keen. It was a sharp, rhythmic striking of the palms, a movement that mimicked the ancient human gesture of finality and despair. In the context of the supernatural encounter, this clapping signaled the closing of the Book of Life. It functioned as a percussion instrument accompanying her song, setting a tempo for the approaching death. The interaction between the witness and the vision followed a strict set of supernatural laws. The entity maintained a specific distance, appearing close enough to be recognized, but remaining forever just out of reach. She operated as a passive observer of the household, her gaze fixed upon the family with an intensity that suggested knowledge rather than malice. She stood as a witness to the inevitable, her presence confirming that the machinery of fate had already been set in motion. The terror she inspired came from her passivity. She appeared not to cause the death, but simply to acknowledge that it had already happened in the future tense. The vocalization followed a strict numerological protocol known in folklore as the Rule of Three. The Banshee rarely wailed continuously. Instead, she issued her warning in 3 distinct sets of cries, separated by heavy, pregnant silences. This tripartite structure mirrored the ancient Celtic obsession with the number 3, echoing the Triskelion and the triple aspect goddesses of the Iron Age. The silence between the cries served a tactical purpose, allowing the terrifying sound to settle into the landscape and giving the listener time to process the inevitability of the message. A single cry might be a mistake of the ear. 3 cries constituted a formal decree of fate. While the entity generally operated as a distant herald, the folklore archives contain a specific subcategory of interference legends that detail the consequences of engaging with the messenger. The Banshee possessed a volatile defense mechanism triggered by human arrogance or mockery. Tales abound of drunkards or skeptics who, upon hearing the wail, shouted insults into the darkness or attempted to capture the figure. This transgression collapsed the safety of the passive observer dynamic. The entity responded with immediate, disproportionate aggression, often physically pursuing the offender back to their threshold. These stories served a didactic function in the community, enforcing a code of respectful distance between the living and the agents of death. The most famous of these retaliatory legends involves the weaponization of her silver comb. In these accounts, a human who steals or finds the comb becomes the target of a relentless siege. The entity stalks the thief to their home, shrieking for the return of her property. If the human attempts to return the comb by handing it to her directly, the folklore states she will tear the arm from the socket. Instead, the correct protocol required the human to pass the comb through the window using a pair of iron tongs. The entity would snatch the comb and, in a parting act of spite, damage the tongs, twisting the iron or slicing through the metal as if it were soft clay. This specific detail emphasized the supernatural physical strength hidden beneath her sorrowful exterior. The encounter often concluded with a physical mark left upon the witness, a touch that served as a permanent reminder of the breach. Those who looked too closely at her face or interfered with her keen reportedly suffered from a sudden graying of the hair or a permanent ringing in the ears, a physiological echo of the scream that never faded. The folklore made the boundary clear. The Banshee existed to be heard and feared, but never touched. She belonged to a category of dangerous divinity where the mere act of proximity carried a radioactive cost to the mortal observer. The terror of the Banshee's cry finds its earthly counterpart in the ancient Irish practice of the keening. To the uninitiated modern ear, the keen appears as an explosion of uncontrolled hysteria, a raw, formless screaming of women over the dead. However, a deeper analysis reveals that the keening constituted a highly structured artistic performance, a complex vocal ritual designed to guide the community through the trauma of loss. It operated as a mnemonic device, a container for the collective memory of the clan. The keen followed a rigid metrical structure, alternating between the goal, the wordless rhythmic wail of pure sorrow, and the mabna, the improvised poetic verse that catalogued the genealogy and virtues of the deceased. At the center of this ritual stood the keening woman, the keening woman. She existed as a professional specialist, distinct from the immediate family of the dead. While the family remained paralyzed by the shock of bereavement, the keener entered the space to perform the grief on their behalf. She functioned as a psychological lightning rod, channeling the chaotic emotions of the room into a tangible, audible form. By externalizing the horror of death through her physical performance, tearing her hair, rending her clothes, and rocking rhythmically, she granted the community permission to collapse. She performed the madness so that the family could eventually return to sanity. The physical appearance of the keening woman during the ritual mirrored the iconography of the Banshee with uncanny precision. In 18th and 19th century Ireland, a woman's hair remained bound and covered in public as a strictly enforced sign of social order and modesty. The keening woman shattered this norm. The moment the ritual began, she unbound her hair, letting it flow loose and wild over her shoulders. This specific act served as a powerful visual signal. The laws of the living world were suspended. By adopting the wild hair aesthetic, the human mourner physically transformed herself into an avatar of the other world, mimicking the Banshee's most famous attribute. She became a temporary Banshee, bridging the gap between the mortal village and the spirit realm. The social position of these women reflected the dangerous nature of their trade. The best keening women commanded immense respect and high fees for their services, often traveling between parishes to officiate at the funerals of the aristocracy. Yet, they also occupied a liminal space on the fringes of acceptable society. Their ability to summon such raw, terrifying emotion on command unnerved the clergy and the more civilized members of the community. They possessed a tragic authority, a power derived from their intimacy with death. Like the executioner or the midwife, the keener handled the biological realities that polite society sought to hide, making her a figure of both necessity and taboo. The text of the keen itself performed a critical historical function. In a culture with a fractured written record, the keening woman acted as the oral historian of the bloodline. Her verses wove the name of the deceased into the larger tapestry of their ancestors, reciting the deeds of fathers, grandfathers, and mythic heroes of the clan. This genealogical keening ensured that the dead man was not merely a corpse rotting in the earth, but the latest link in an unbroken chain of nobility. It reaffirmed the identity of the survivors, reminding them of who they were and where they came from. This recitation often contained a subversive element. The keener held the license to speak hard truths that were forbidden in ordinary conversation. She could criticize the enemies of the deceased, rail against the injustice of the death, whether caused by landlord, soldier, or famine, and voice the collective anger of the people. In this context, the keen transformed from a song of mourning into a political weapon. It validated the community's suffering and directed their rage, turning the funeral into a potent reaffirmation of local sovereignty against external forces. The parallels between the keening woman and the Banshee extended beyond the visual. Both figures appeared as solo female agents who vocalized the transition of the soul. Both utilized the power of sound to mark the boundaries of the community. The anthropologist Angela Burke argues that the Banshee essentially represents the archetypal keener, a projection of the human mourning ritual onto the supernatural landscape. When the human woman keened, she was participating in a divine mimetic act, aligning her voice with the frequency of the goddess who watched from the tumulus. The boundary between the human ritual and the supernatural event remained dangerously porous. In the mental map of the Irish peasantry, the act of keening operated as more than a simple expression of sorrow. It functioned as a sonic beacon that bridged the gap between the worlds. Folklore accounts frequently mention the phenomenon of the uninvited guest at the wake. Mourners would report hearing a voice join the chorus that possessed a timbre and volume beyond human capacity, a shivering note that shattered glass or caused the candles to flicker violently. The community understood this presence immediately. The Banshee had accepted the invitation inherent in the song and arrived to mourn her own. This convergence created a profound anxiety surrounding the keening woman herself. While the community required her services, they viewed her with a potent mixture of necessity and suspicion. A woman who could channel the voice of the other world so perfectly risked becoming permanently tainted by the contact. Legends exist of keeners who fell into a black trance during the ritual, their eyes rolling back, and their voices altering to mimic the exact pitch of the Banshee's cry. In these moments, the woman ceased to be a neighbor or a villager. She became a vessel, a biological instrument played by the spirit of the mound. The ritual granted her temporary diplomatic immunity in the land of the dead, but it also marked her as strange or touched long after the funeral ended. The power of the keen carried a specific spiritual risk known as the tether. Irish folklore dictated strict boundaries regarding the duration and intensity of the mourning. While the cry served to guide the soul away from the body, an excessive or overly possessive keen could have the inverse effect, trapping the spirit in the domestic sphere. The Banshee's presence often served as a regulator in this dynamic. Her cry signaled the finality of the departure. If the human family continued to wail after the entity had fallen silent, they risked acting against the natural order, holding the ghost prisoner through the sheer gravity of their grief. The Banshee's silence acted as the command to release the dead. This dynamic reveals the subtle hierarchy between the human and the divine mourner. The keening woman performed the ritual for the comfort of the living, but the Banshee performed it for the transit of the dead. The human woman mimicked the goddess to claim a fraction of her power, validating the family's suffering by elevating it to a mythological status. By dressing like the Banshee, acting like the Banshee, and sounding like the Banshee, the keener enacted a form of sympathetic magic. She transformed the ugly, senseless reality of biological death into a grand, supernatural drama where the deceased was important enough to be wept for by the gods themselves. The physical toll of this mimicry reinforced the connection. Keeners often required days to recover from a major wake, suffering from a condition the locals described as grief sickness. This exhaustion stemmed from more than vocal exertion. It represented a spiritual depletion. The act of simulating the Banshee's despair required the woman to touch the edge of the void, to inhabit a psychological space of absolute loss. In this sense, the keening woman served as a sacrificial figure for the community. She absorbed the toxicity of the death so that the family could survive it, just as the Banshee absorbed the death of the lineage into the landscape itself. The two figures, one flesh, one spirit, stood as mirror images, united by the burden of the scream. The Banshee operated under a strict code of supernatural elitism. Unlike the common ghost or the poltergeist, which might plague any house regardless of station, the Banshee functioned as an exclusive spiritual privilege attached to the ancient aristocracy of Ireland. Folklore codified this exclusivity in the famous rhyme that bound the entity to the Milesian families, those bearing the prefixes O and Mac. This distinction transformed the terrifying wail into a perverse status symbol. To be haunted by a Banshee served as the ultimate genealogical proof of one's nobility. It confirmed that the dying man or woman possessed pure Gaelic blood, untainted by the waves of Viking, Norman, or English invasions that had reshaped the island's demography. This connection to the Milesians, the mythological sons of Míle Spine, who supposedly conquered Ireland in the deep pre-Christian past, framed the entity as a guardian of the indigenous order. In the turbulent political landscape of 17th and 18th century Ireland, where the native nobility saw their lands confiscated and their titles stripped by the English crown, the Banshee remained the one asset that could not be seized. A chieftain might lose his castle to a Cromwellian settler. He might be reduced to a tenant farmer on his own ancestral land, but the Banshee remembered his rank. The Great O'Neill clan, for example, claimed a specific ancestral spirit named Maureen, who attended solely to their line regardless of their poverty. She recognized the blood, not the bank account. This genetic haunting implies a profound theological shift in how we understand the entity. The Banshee acts less like a ghost and more like a collective external soul of the family. She represents the accumulated history of the lineage, a spiritual hard drive that stores the memory of every O'Neill or O'Brien who has ever lived. When she screams, she is not merely mourning the individual dying in the bed. She is mourning the depletion of the stock. She is the mother of the tribe, watching one of her children return to the earth. This explains the intimacy of the encounter. She is not a stranger breaking in, but a matriarch coming home. Consequently, the folklore strictly denies the presence of the Banshee to the planter stock, the English and Scottish settlers who arrived later in history. For a family of English descent to claim a Banshee was seen as a desperate social affectation, a fraudulent attempt to purchase antiquity. The entity practiced a fierce biological discrimination. She followed the DNA of the Gael with the loyalty of a wolf pack. If a member of the true blood died in a ditch, she was there. If a usurper died in a silk bed, the night remained silent. This partition reinforced the cultural divide, making the terror of the Banshee a distinct component of the native Irish identity, a shared trauma that bound the defeated clans together in the dark. This exclusivity created a paradox where the most terrifying sound in the Irish landscape also became a source of grim comfort. The cry confirmed that the deceased belonged to something older and greater than their current circumstances. It served as a final act of defiance against the erasure of history. Even in death, the O and the Mac commanded the attention of the gods. The Banshee stood as the keeper of the covenant, ensuring that while a family might lose everything else, they would never lose the dignity of their own doom. The theory of the genetic haunting faced its ultimate stress test during the Great Famine and the subsequent mass exodus of the Irish people. As millions fled the island for the Americas, Australia, and Britain, a logical question arose. Would the fairy woman of the mound, an entity linguistically and mythologically tied to the specific topography of Ireland, remain behind? The folklore archives provide a definitive answer. The Banshee possessed a terrifying portability. She boarded the coffin ships alongside her families, detaching herself from the ancient tumuli to become a nomadic spirit. The covenant of blood proved stronger than the gravity of the land. Oral histories from the diaspora recount the specific mechanics of this migration. Witnesses described seeing a grey crow perching on the rigging of ships departing Cove or Galway, a bird that refused to fly back to shore as the coast vanished. Others spoke of a following presence that hovered in the wake of the vessel, a wailing heard over the roar of the Atlantic storms. The entity effectively transformed from a genius loci, spirit of a place, into a genius gentis, spirit of a people. She viewed the Atlantic Ocean not as a boundary, but merely as a wet road connecting the scattered fragments of the clan. Upon arrival in the New World, the phenomenology of the encounter adapted to the industrial environment. In the dense tenement districts of Boston, New York, and Liverpool, the Banshee's cry competed with the mechanical noise of the city. Yet, the accounts insist that the sound retained its ability to cut through the ambient cacophony. Irish immigrants living in Lowell or Hell's Kitchen reported hearing the familiar keen rising above the rattle of streetcars and the whistle of factory steam. The entity demonstrated a capacity to locate her target within the vertical labyrinth of the modern city with the same precision she had employed in the open bogs of Munster. The brick walls and iron fire escapes of the tenement offered no insulation against the warning. This translocation produced a unique psychological dissonance for the witness. In rural Ireland, the Banshee harmonized with the landscape. She belonged to the wind and the ruins. In the urban American diaspora, she became an anomaly, a violent intrusion of the ancient past into the modern present. Her appearance on a fire escape or outside a factory window served as a jarring reminder of the identity the immigrant had tried to leave behind or preserve. She stood as a refusal of assimilation. No matter how far the O or the Mac traveled, or how successfully they integrated into the new society, the Banshee ensured they remained Irish in the hour of their death. The phenomenon extended to the furthest reaches of the British Empire. In the Australian bush, the cry often confused settlers who mistook it for the call of the dingo or the curlew, only to recognize the rhythmic, human sorrow embedded within the sound. These accounts from the Southern Hemisphere highlight the sheer tenacity of the spiritual bond. The Banshee tracked the bloodline across hemispheres, adjusting her manifestation to fit the alien acoustics of the outback or the Canadian wilderness. She became the ultimate companion of the exile, the one piece of home that required no luggage and no ticket. However, a subtle shift occurred in the function of the Banshee in the diaspora. In Ireland, she warned of death. Abroad, she often announced the death of a relative back home. This transatlantic telepathy became a staple of immigrant folklore. A daughter in Boston would hear the cry at the exact moment her mother died in County Cork, weeks before the letter arrived by ship. In this context, the Banshee operated as a supernatural telegraph service, collapsing the distance between the divided family. She maintained the integrity of the clan's information network, ensuring that the emotional impact of the death arrived synchronously, regardless of the physical miles separating the kin. Ultimately, the diaspora Banshee fulfilled a role of soul retrieval. The great fear of the Irish emigrant was to die on foreign soil, to be buried in unconsecrated ground far from the ancestors. The presence of the Banshee at the deathbed in New York or Sydney offered a metaphysical reassurance. Her arrival suggested that the soul was not being abandoned to the foreign earth. She had come to collect the spirit and shepherd it back across the ocean to the family plot. She acted as the psychopomp who ensured that while the body might rest in the Bronx, the soul returned to the Ben Bulben. While the Victorian imagination sanitized the Banshee into a pale, melancholy lady of the manor, the older strata of Gaelic folklore preserves a far more visceral manifestation, the Ben Nia, or the washerwoman. This entity strips away the romanticism of the genetic haunting to reveal the raw, grotesque machinery of fate. In this iteration, the spirit abandons the domestic threshold of the window or the garden gate. She retreats to the wilderness, taking up residence at the ford, the shallow crossing point of a river. This shift in geography signals a shift in function. The Ben Nia acts less as a mourner and more as a fatal technician, engaged in the labor of death before the death has even occurred. The auditory landscape changes dramatically in this context. The famous, melodious wail of the Banshee vanishes, replaced by a repetitive, percussive sound, the slapping of wet cloth against wet stone. Folklore accounts describe the sound as resembling the noise of a flail hitting a threshing floor, or the clapping of two heavy books. This rhythmic beetling, the traditional method of washing clothes, serves as a different kind of siren song. It lures the traveler off the road, drawing them toward the riverbank to investigate the source of the midnight labor. The horror lies in the mundane nature of the sound. It mimics domestic work, but occurs in a setting of absolute isolation and darkness. The physical description of the washer defies the ethereal ghost archetype entirely. Scottish and Northern Irish accounts describe a creature of grotesque, amphibious anatomy. She appears diminutive, often child-sized, but broad and powerful. Key features distinguish her from the human realm. She possesses only one nostril, a sign of otherworldliness, protruding teeth, and large, webbed feet often colored a deep, alarming red. This redness connects her to the blood she washes, suggesting that the violence of her trade has stained her very skin. She wears the green of the fairy host rather than the white of the ghost, identifying her as a distinct species of elemental spirit, a being woven from the mud and water of the landscape itself. The location of the ford carries immense mythological weight. In Celtic topology, the ford serves as the ultimate liminal space, a place that is not a place. It exists between the two banks, belonging to neither side. It represents a crack in the world where the barrier between the mortal realm and the she, the other world, dissolves. By occupying this space, the Ben-Nia controls the point of transition. She guards the crossing, ensuring that anyone who passes from one bank to the other acknowledges the toll. This aligns perfectly with her role as a death omen. She stands at the fluid boundary between the living and the dead, washing the evidence of the crossing that is about to happen. The Ben-Nia represents the active aspect of the death goddess. The traditional Banshee cries for the dead, implying a passive helplessness in the face of fate. The washer works for the dead. Her labor creates the reality of the inevitable. The act of washing the clothes acts as a form of sympathetic magic. As she scrubs the phantom blood from the spectral tunic, she creates the conditions for the actual blood to be spilled on the battlefield or in the accident. She serves as the grim laundress of the gods, keeping the inventory of the afterlife clean and prepared for the new arrivals. The horror of the Ben-Nia encounter centers on the object of her labor. Upon approaching the ford, the witness inevitably looks to the garments being thrashed against the stones. In folklore, these are rarely random scraps of cloth. They manifest as the specific, recognizable garments of the living. The washer holds up a tunic, a cloak, or a shirt that belongs to a member of the local community, or in the most terrifying accounts, to the witness himself. The fabric appears saturated with fresh, bright blood, turning the river water downstream into a crimson ribbon. This creates a jarring visual paradox. The observer stands on the bank, wearing the very shirt that the spirit is currently washing free of blood in the river below. This interaction introduces a complex temporal mechanic to the mythology. The Ben-Nia operates in a state of future-present simultaneity. She perceives the violence that has not yet happened as an event that has already occurred. To her ancient eyes, the man standing on the bank is already a corpse, his clothes already stiff with gore. She engages in the act of cleaning them, not to prevent the death, but to prepare the body for its final presentation. She washes the shroud before the heart has stopped beating. This collapses the timeline of the victim's life. The moment he sees his own shirt in her hands, his remaining hours on earth become a mere formality. He exists as a walking ghost, technically alive, but legally dead in the jurisdiction of the otherworld. The volume of the laundry often indicated the scale of the coming tragedy. While the Banshee's cry might warn of a single passing, the washer at the ford frequently appeared prior to great battles or clan skirmishes. In these instances, she would be seen washing a great heap of armor and tunics, the pile rising beside her like a cairn of stones. This image of mass laundry served as a strategic intelligence report for the marching armies. If a chieftain saw the washer cleaning a pile of his clan's specific tartan or crest, he understood that the battle was lost before the first arrow flew. The quantity of the bloody water allowed the observer to estimate the casualty count with chilling accuracy. The specificity of the garments reinforced the inescapable nature of the omen. Folklore from the Scottish Highlands, which shares the Ben-Nia tradition with Ireland, emphasizes that the clothes often bore the unique stitching or mistakes of the owner's wife or mother. This detail removed any hope of mistaken identity. The spirit presented the victim with irrefutable forensic evidence of their own demise. This transformed the encounter from a generic supernatural scare into a deeply personal psychological assault. The entity knew the weave of the victim's clothes, implying an intimate, voyeuristic knowledge of their daily life. She had been watching them dress every morning, waiting for the day the fabric would turn red. The visceral nature of this omen served a different function than the Banshee's cry. The cry evoked sorrow. The bloody laundry evoked nausea and primal fear. It focused on the physicality of death, the tearing of flesh, the spilling of blood, the ruin of the body. The Ben-Nia was not concerned with the soul's transit to heaven. She was concerned with the biological mess left behind on the battlefield. She represented the earth claiming its due. The blood washing into the river symbolized the return of the life force to the land, a recycling of vitality that cared nothing for the individual consciousness attached to it. Historically, this figure connects the Banshee myth back to the sovereignty goddesses of the Iron Age, specifically the Bibe, Battle Crow. In the ancient sagas, the goddess would appear before a king not to comfort him, but to doom him. The washing of the armor acted as the withdrawal of her protection. By cleaning the death gore off the clothes in advance, she was essentially declaring the contract between the king and the land null and void. The king had failed, or his time was up, and the goddess was scrubbing his influence from the world to make way for the next ruler. The encounter also carried a heavy implication of fate as labor. The Ben-Nia is never depicted as idle. She is always working, sweating, and straining over the stones. This portrays death not as a peaceful sleep, but as hard, industrial work. The destiny of the clan required maintenance. The blood had to be washed, the linen had to be prepared, the cycle had to be greased with the labor of the gods. This adds a layer of grim pragmatism to the folklore. The otherworld was not a place of rest. It was a place of eternal maintenance, where the spirits worked tirelessly to process the messy consequences of human mortality. Finally, the visibility of the blood served as the ultimate anti-hope. In many European legends, a ghost might offer a riddle or a chance to escape. The washer offered only a statement of fact. The blood was already on the shirt. The presence of the stain in the future meant that the wound was inevitable in the present. This linear determinism terrified the Celtic mind. It suggested that free will was an illusion, and that our bodies are merely vessels waiting to be broken at a pre-appointed hour, the cleanup crew already scheduled and working the shift before the accident even happens. Despite the overwhelming fatalism of the omen, the folklore of the Ben-Nia contains a rare interactive clause. Unlike the classic Banshee, who exists as a distant, untouchable frequency, the washer at the ford possesses physical solidity and, more importantly, a vulnerability to human cunning. The legends describe a high-stakes gambit available to the brave or desperate traveler. If a human could approach the ford silently and manage to stand between the washer and the water before she noticed his presence, the power dynamic inverted instantly. By cutting off her retreat to the element of water, the human trapped the spirit in the physical realm, forcing her to enter into a negotiation. The mechanism of this submission involved a ritual of shocking intimacy known as the fosterage of the breast. Upon seizing the trapped entity, the folklore dictates that the human must demand to be taken as her foster child. In the most archaic and visceral versions of the tale, the human was required to physically suckle from the washer's long, withered breast. This grotesque act established an unbreakable legal bond under Celtic law. By consuming the milk of the otherworld, the human transformed the terrifying death hag into a foster mother. The laws of the Sidhe compelled her to cease her hostile labor and grant the requests of her new, adoptive son. Once the bond was sealed, the entity offered the traditional folklore payout, the granting of 3 wishes. However, the nature of these wishes reveals the pragmatic mindset of the Celtic warrior caste. They rarely asked for gold or eternal life. Instead, they demanded intelligence. They asked for the names of who would die in the coming battle, for the outcome of the war, or for the specific knowledge of their own time of death. The Ben-Nia functioned as a tactical computer. Capturing her allowed the chieftain to extract the casualty list in advance. This turned the supernatural encounter into a military asset, allowing the hero to alter his strategy, though rarely his fate. The consequences of failure, however, carried a terrible physical price. If the washer spotted the intruder first, or if he stepped on a dry branch and broke the silence, she would strike the water with her washing beetle, wooden bat. This action weaponized the river itself. The splash would hit the legs of the intruder, resulting in a curse known as the wetting of the legs. The limb touched by the water would instantly wither or become paralyzed, leaving the traveler crippled for life. This physical maiming served as a permanent brand of his failure, marking him as a man who tried to cheat fate and lost. This interplay suggests a profound connection to the sovereignty-testing myths of the Iron Age. In these ancient stories, the future king is often tested by a hideous hag who demands a kiss or sexual intimacy. If he refuses, he fails. If he accepts the horror, she reveals herself as the beautiful goddess of the land. The Ben-Nia encounter represents a degraded, folkloric memory of this royal initiation. The hero must embrace the ugliness of death, literally suckling at the breast of the hag, to gain the wisdom required to rule or survive. It reinforces the Celtic maxim that true power requires an intimacy with the dark, grotesque cycles of nature. The most famous interaction in the mythology involves the hero Cuchulainn. Riding to his final battle, he encounters the washer cleaning his own armor. Unlike the cunning heroes of the folklore who trap the spirit, Cuchulainn, resigned to his doom, simply acknowledges her. This moment of recognition marks the completion of his hero's journey. He does not try to stop her. He understands that her labor is the necessary punctuation mark to his life. The washer does not kill the hero. She merely validates that his story has reached its final chapter. Even for those who successfully wrestled the wish, the entity offered a monkey's paw variation of the truth. She could tell a man when he would die, but she rarely granted the power to stop it. The knowledge became a burden. A warrior told he would die by the shore of the lake would spend the rest of his life in terror of water, his life narrowing around the prophecy. The Ben-Nia ultimately taught the harsh lesson that knowing the future does not equate to controlling it. She remained the servant of a deterministic universe, and her gift often proved heavier than the curse. To understand the true identity of the Banshee, we must look past the wailing ghost of the 19th century and excavate the literal meaning of her name. In the Irish language, Banshee translates directly to woman of the fairy mound. This etymology tethers the entity to a specific feature of the Irish landscape: the sea. These are not the whimsical flower gardens of Victorian fantasy, but the massive Neolithic earthen mounds and passage tombs that dominate the countryside, such as Newgrange, Noath, and Douth. These structures serve as the physical residence of the entity. The Banshee is not a wandering spirit of the air. She is a resident of the hollow earth, an entity who emerges from the heavy clay of the burial chamber to patrol her territory. The occupants of these mounds possess a lineage far older than the human families they haunt. In the Book of Invasions, the mythological history of Ireland, these mounds serve as the retreat of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. These were the old gods of Ireland, a race of beautiful, high magic beings who ruled the island before the arrival of the human Milesians. Defeated in battle and displaced by the arrival of mortal men, the Tuatha Dé Danann did not leave Ireland. Instead, they struck a treaty to divide the world in half. The humans took the surface, and the gods took the world below, retreating into the ancient burial mounds to establish a parallel civilization underground. This historical context redefines the Banshee completely. She represents a member of this displaced pantheon. She is a woman of the Tuatha Dé, a goddess who has survived the conversion to Christianity by diminishing into a folklore figure. Her magic is simply the advanced technology of the old gods, remembered as sorcery by the human peasantry. When she appears to the O and the Mac families, the descendants of the Milesians who conquered her people, she acts as a bridge between the two halves of the treaty. She is the ancient neighbor coming up from the basement of reality to warn the tenants of the house that death is approaching. The transformation of the Banshee from a goddess to a fairy woman illustrates the process of euhemerization, the degradation of mythology into folklore. Over centuries of Christian dominance, the terrifying majesty of the Tuatha Dé Danann eroded. The Church reclassified these pagan deities not as gods, but as fallen angels or fairies, stripping them of their cosmic authority while acknowledging their persistent presence. The Banshee stands as the primary victim of this cultural demotion. She retains the power of prophecy and the aura of terror, but she has lost her sovereignty. She no longer rules the land. She merely haunts the families who do. However, traces of her divine origin remain embedded in her aesthetic. The folklore consistently describes the Banshee wearing colors associated with the otherworld: bright red, green, and white. In Celtic mythology, white with red ears is the specific coloration of animals from the Sidhe, marking them as supernatural livestock. The Ben Nia's red-webbed feet and the Banshee's red eyes serve as color-coded signals of her divinity. Furthermore, her immense height, often described as towering over mortal men, echoes the descriptions of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were physically perfect specimens of the Golden Age. The connection between the mound and the ancestor provides the final key to her psychology. The Sidhe mounds function primarily as tombs, the repositories of the collective dead. By dwelling within the tomb, the Banshee assumes the role of the ancestral mother. She is the collective spirit of all the mothers, grandmothers, and matriarchs of the clan who have gone before. When she screams, she speaks with the voice of the entire lineage. This explains the specific emotional quality of her cry. It is not malicious, but maternal. It is the sound of the Great Mother grieving the loss of yet another child from her tribe. This ancestral connection reveals why the Banshee haunts specific territories. Many of the great Irish families are associated with specific local mounds or landscapes: the O'Briens with Crag Leath, the O'Neills with Tullahoge. In these locations, the Banshee often bears a specific name, such as Eval or Cleaner. These are not generic spirits. They are named local goddesses who have acted as the tutelary deity of that specific region for millennia. Eval protects the Dalcash tribe. Cleaner protects the Desmonds. The Banshee is simply a generic title for these specific, powerful female intelligences who entered into a marriage contract with the land and its rulers. The survival of the Banshee myth into the modern era serves as a testament to the stubbornness of this geography. While the temples fell and the religion changed, the mounds remained. The physical presence of the Sidhe in the landscape acted as a permanent anchor for the belief. You could burn the books, but you could not easily erase a 40-foot stone tumulus. As long as the mound stood, the woman of the mound remained a plausible reality. She endured because her home was built of stone and earth, immune to the shifting tides of theology. The identification of the Banshee as a tutelary goddess leads us to the central political concept of ancient Irish paganism, the doctrine of sovereignty. In the Celtic worldview, the land of Ireland operated as a conscious, female entity. To rule the land, a king required more than military might or blood right. He required a spiritual marriage contract with this entity. This ritual, known as the Banshee Ree, wedding of the king, involved the ceremonial union of the mortal ruler with the goddess of the land. The Banshee, in her original form, served as the bride in this cosmic arrangement. She represented the personification of the territory itself, the mountains, the rivers, and the soil, granting the king the right to rule. This theological framework recontextualizes the Banshee's cry. When the entity wails for the death of an O'Neill or an O'Connor, she performs a political function rather than a purely emotional one. She is not merely a sad ghost, she is the widowed sovereignty of the tribe. Her scream signifies the dissolution of the sacred marriage. The death of the king breaks the contract between the people and the land, plunging the territory into a state of chaotic widowhood. The messenger of death is, in reality, the dethroned queen, announcing that the throne is empty and the protection of the otherworld has been withdrawn until a new suitor can be found. The mythology of the loathsome lady supports this thesis, providing a direct link between the beautiful Banshee and the withered hag. The legend of Niall of the 9 hostages describes a group of brothers hunting in the wilderness who encounter a hideous crone guarding a well. She demands a kiss in exchange for water. Only Niall has the courage to embrace the monstrosity. Upon kissing her, the hag transforms into the most beautiful woman in the world, revealing herself as the sovereignty of Ireland. She declares, "King and chieftain shalt thou be," confirming that the ugly crone and the beautiful goddess exist as two faces of the same entity. This duality explains the Banshee's shifting appearance in the later folklore. The Hag of the Mist represents the goddess in her winter aspect, the land without a king, or the land mourning a dead king. The beautiful maiden represents the goddess in her summer aspect, the land united with a rightful ruler. The witness who sees the withered old woman washing the clothes at the ford is encountering the sovereignty of Ireland in her state of decay and loss. The ugliness of the Banshee serves as a barometer for the political health of the tribe. She withers because the leadership has failed or died. The persistence of the Banshee myth among the aristocratic families specifically reinforces the sovereignty connection. These families, the O and the Mac, claim direct descent from the High Kings who once participated in these marriage rituals. The Banshee continues to haunt them because the contract, though forgotten by the humans, remains valid in the memory of the earth. She follows the O'Neill not because he is a nice man, but because his DNA holds the dormant title deeds to the province. She is the spectral bureaucrat of a fallen empire, meticulously tracking the succession of a monarchy that effectively ceased to exist in the 17th century. The mechanism of the keening takes on a new dimension when viewed through this lens. In the ancient texts, the health of the king and the fertility of the land were inextricably linked. A righteous king presided over good harvests. A false or dead king brought famine. The Banshee's wail, therefore, acts as an ecological alarm. It signals the onset of the wasteland period, the dangerous interregnum between kings when the land becomes sterile. Her grief is not just for the man, but for the vitality of the fields and the herds that will suffer in his absence. She mourns the impending collapse of the natural order. This explains the Banshee's intense hostility toward the usurper or the English settler. Under the laws of sovereignty, a king must be chosen by the goddess. A conqueror who takes the land by force without the ritual marriage is viewed by the entity as a rapist of the territory. The land rejects him. The Banshee refuses to cry for his death because no contract exists to be broken. Her silence acts as a form of supernatural resistance, a denial of legitimacy. By withholding her grief, she denies the settler entry into the history of the sacred landscape, treating him as a temporary infestation rather than a husband of the earth. Ultimately, the sovereignty thesis elevates the Banshee from a spooky story to a profound symbol of national identity. She represents the enduring, unconquerable soul of Ireland itself. Invaders may burn the castles, ban the language, and outlaw the laws, but they cannot silence the woman in the mound. She remains the keeper of the true succession, appearing generation after generation to remind the scattered descendants of the clans that they are still bound to the soil by a marriage vow that transcends death, defeat, and time. The final excavation of the Banshee's identity reveals a figure far more terrifying than a mere ancestral ghost. The behavior of the Banshee, her wailing, her washing of bloody armor, and her prophecy of death aligns perfectly with the attributes of the Morrigan, the ancient Irish triple goddess of war and fate. Specifically, the Banshee appears to be a direct folkloric survival of the aspect known as Bí Catha, the battle crow. In the pre-Christian sagas, the Bibe did not fight with a sword. She fought with psychology. She hovered over the battlefield in the form of a hooded crow or a screaming hag, using her voice to sow terror and confusion among the enemy ranks. Her shriek possessed the power to shatter the morale of an entire army, causing seasoned warriors to die of sheer fright before a weapon ever touched them. This lineage clarifies the screaming mechanic of the Banshee. The cry of the Bibe was known as the Bibe Simha, a sonic weapon designed to announce the doom of a king. Over centuries of oral tradition, as the gods became ghosts, this battle scream softened into the mourning wail. The entity evolved from a deity who caused death through terror into a spirit who mourned death through sorrow. Yet, the core function remains identical, a supernatural female voice breaking the silence to announce the end of a life. The Banshee is simply the Bibe seen through the lens of defeat. She is the war goddess, with her sword taken away, left with only her voice. The visual iconography of the hooded crow provides the strongest forensic evidence for this connection. In many rural counties, the Banshee is still referred to as the Bibe, and is said to manifest as a crow sitting on the windowsill or a black bird perching on the chimney. This specific bird, the scavenger of the battlefield, served as the totem of the Morrigan because it fed on the slain. By appearing as a crow, the Banshee signals her ancient role as the feeder of ravens. She arrives at the house not just to warn the family, but to mark the body for the earth, claiming her portion of the harvest, just as she claimed the bodies of falling warriors in the Iron Age. The connection solidifies when we examine the most famous death in Irish mythology, that of the hero Cú Chulainn. In the saga, the Morrigan appears to him not as a warrior, but as a washerwoman scrubbing his bloody armor in the ford. This literary moment serves as the patient zero for the entire Ben Nia folklore tradition. Every story of a washerwoman told by a Scottish or Irish peasant in the 19th century is an unknowing echo of this specific Iron Age myth. The peasant had forgotten Cú Chulainn, but they remembered the woman at the river. The Ben Nia is, quite literally, the Morrigan waiting for the hero to die. This genealogical link explains the aristocratic bias of the Banshee we explored in Act 2. The Morrigan was the specific patroness of the warrior caste and the High Kings. She did not concern herself with the deaths of farmers or shepherds. She dealt only in the currency of heroic death. Consequently, when her myth degraded into the Banshee folklore, the entity retained this snobbish preference for the nobility. She continued to haunt the O'Neills and O'Briens because they were the descendants of the warrior caste she once commanded. Her exclusivity is simply the lingering memory of her original divine jurisdiction. The shift from the red washer to the white lady reflects the Christianization of the aesthetic. The church could not completely erase the figure, so it sanitized her. The terrifying, blood-caked goddess of the battlefield was slowly repainted as a sorrowful, pale ghost in a shroud. Her red robes, the color of blood, and the otherworld were bleached into white grave clothes. Her scream of triumph became a scream of loss. However, the folklore never quite forgot the danger. The persistence of the red eyes, the comb, a siren tool, and the anger of the Banshee reveals that the dangerous goddess remained alive beneath the white shroud of the ghost. Furthermore, the Morrigan's role as a shapeshifter perfectly accounts for the confusing physical descriptions of the Banshee found in the archives. Witnesses in the 1930s described the Banshee variously as a bird, a rabbit, a weasel, or a woman. This zoological chaos mirrors the Morrigan's own behavior in the sagas, where she attacks Cuchulainn as an eel, a wolf, and a heifer. The Banshee's instability of form is not a contradiction in folklore. It is a direct inheritance of the goddess's primary power. She is a fluid entity, capable of wearing whatever skin the moment requires to communicate the message of mortality. Ultimately, identifying the Banshee as the Bibe restores the dignity of the figure. She is not a demon or a damned soul. She represents a necessary cosmic function. In the pagan worldview, death required a facilitator, someone to cut the thread, to choose the slain, and to wash the evidence. The Banshee is the memory of the time when death was a woman, a powerful, dark-cloaked administrator who stood at the edge of the world and managed the difficult transition from this life to the next. She screams not because she is sad, but because the gate is opening, and the energy of that opening shatters the silence of the human world. The decline of the Banshee in the Irish consciousness parallels the systematic suppression of her human counterpart, the Keening woman. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland waged a relentless war against the heathen practice of keening. The church viewed the wake, with its alcohol, its games, and its uncontrolled wild vocalizations, as a dangerous relic of paganism that threatened the solemnity of the Christian resurrection. The priest saw the Keening woman not as a necessary psychological vessel for the community, but as a rival authority figure who presided over a ritual of chaos. Her ability to whip the crowd into an ecstatic frenzy competed directly with the church's attempt to impose order, silence, and submission upon the moment of death. This antagonism became codified in canon law. The clerical suppression intensified significantly in the mid-17th century, most notably with decrees issued at the Synod of Tuam in 1660 and later reaffirmed at the Synod of Cashel in 1748. These councils issued strict prohibitions against the hiring of professional mourners, explicitly linking the practice to superstition and disorder. The clergy levied heavy fines against families who allowed the uproar of the keen to take place under their roof, and in some parishes, priests refused to perform the funeral mass if a Keening woman had been present at the wake. The church aimed to replace the wild cry of the ancestor with the quiet prayer of the rosary. This substitution was strategic. The keen directed the energy of the mourners outward to the community and the landscape, while the rosary directed it upward to a silent God. The Great Famine of the 1840s accelerated this cultural silence. The sheer scale of the death during that time broke the machinery of the traditional wake. with entire villages decimated and the survivors scattering to the coffin ships, the complex social networks required to support the keening collapsed. In the post-famine reconstruction, a new Ireland emerged, one that desperately sought respectability and distance from the backward peasant traditions of the past. The rising Catholic middle class viewed the keen as a badge of poverty and ignorance. Silence became a status symbol. To bury one's dead with quiet dignity signaled that the family had entered the modern world. To bury them with a scream signaled that they remained trapped in the bog. As the human voices fell silent, the supernatural voice faded in sympathy. The Banshee, who had always functioned as a mirror to the human ritual, lost her acoustic habitat. The modernization of the Irish landscape, the electrification of the rural night, the draining of the wetlands, and the intrusion of radio and television stripped away the sensory conditions necessary for the encounter. The lonely ford became a bridged road. The dark cottage became a lit bungalow. The entity did not vanish because she ceased to exist. She vanished because the culture that sustained her ceased to listen. She retreated back into the mound, silenced by the noise of the 20th century. However, anthropologists argue that the disappearance of the keen left a psychological wound in the Irish psyche. The keening had provided a structured, communal outlet for trauma. Its removal privatized grief, forcing the individual to carry the burden alone behind closed doors. In this light, the fading of the Banshee represents the loss of a collective coping mechanism. The scary story had a purpose. It externalized the horror of death, turning it into a shared experience. When we stopped telling the story, we did not defeat the fear. We merely locked ourselves in the room with it. In the final analysis, the Banshee stands as far more than a simple ghost story or a Halloween trope. She represents the oldest and most resilient memory of the Irish people. We have traced her lineage from the battlefields of the Iron Age, where she flew as the goddess of war, to the medieval river fords, where she washed the armor of kings, and finally to the twilight windows of the 19th century cottage. Through every transformation, she maintained a singular, vital function. She forced the human community to confront the reality of death with reverence rather than denial. She served as the dark guardian of the transition, ensuring that no life ended without the landscape itself offering a testament to its value. The terror she inspired operated as a paradox, for within the fear lay a profound validation. To be haunted by the Banshee meant that one belonged to a lineage worth mourning. Her cry confirmed that the individual was woven into the ancient tapestry of the tribe, held in the memory of the earth. In a world that often treats death as a medical failure or a bureaucratic inconvenience, the Banshee offered a different perspective. She framed death as a cosmic event, a disruption so significant that it required a divine messenger to announce it. Her scream was the ultimate compliment paid by the otherworld to the mortal soul. Today, the mounds of the Sidhe remain silent, and the professional keeners have long since gone to their own graves. Yet, the archetype endures in the subconscious of the culture. The Banshee remains the personification of grief that is too vast for a single human heart to bear. She reminds us that sorrow is natural, that the bond between the living and the dead cannot be severed by the grave, and that some tragedies are so profound that even the stones and the wind must weep for them. She is the shadow that proves the light. She is the scream that proves the love.